Well, we're studying through the book of 1 Corinthians, and this series I've entitled Lessons in How Not to Be a Christian. Because Corinth was really God's problem church. It had only been 18 months since the Apostle Paul founded the church, and the thing was rife with conflicts, and with sin, and with bad theology, and with just a bunch of crud, and Paul is like pulling his hair out. He's dictating this letter to Sosthenes, and he can hardly wait to get into the meat of the matter. Now, lesson one really was, you don't belong to yourself, and neither does your church, by the way. You belong to God. That's an important first step for us to realize that, as Paul says, you were bought with a price. He says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who died for me. Lesson number two, don't worship your pastor. That was one of the big problems they had there at Corinth. People were saying, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Christ, I'm above all you guys, and my pastor can beat up your pastor. And we talked about the rampant problem of superstar pastors that exist today in the world, and the dangers, both for the church and for the individual, when we begin paying more attention to the man than the man, if you know what I mean. So now we come to lesson three. And in lesson three, Paul's not taking aim at superstar pastors. He's taking aim at the philosophies and the value system that exists in the culture in the world around us. Now, the Corinthians were very much in the middle of a culture that valued philosophy. They valued discussion as a way at arriving at truth. And if you don't think that exists today, just talk to anybody in sort of the postmodern ideals, where truth is not absolute at all. It's very relative. And people will tell you that you'll gather together in a group of people like this, and you'll all share what you think is the truth, and each piece of that will make the truth for us today. If we meet with a different group of people, then the truth changes. So truth is very relevant. Philosophical discussions are very relevant even today, even if they don't call it philosophy. But Corinth was a society that was steeped in that. And in Acts chapter 17, Paul was in Athens, and he was at the Areopagus with a bunch of folks that love to talk philosophy and new ideas. It says, all the Athenians and the foreigners residing there spent their time on nothing else but telling or hearing something new. Always looking for something new. What's the latest and greatest? You walk through the aisles of Borders Bookstore, and you can tell people have come up with all kinds of new ideas. They seem new, they aren't really, but it's like the latest and greatest thing. Because that old dusty, musty Bible, that can't have any real relevance today. That can't be the real absolute truth. There is no absolute truth, right? Sadly, in some ways, we as a Christian culture are actually moving in that direction. And I was quite frankly shocked to read an article in last Sunday's Portland Oregonian, in an article entitled, My House of Worship is Your House. I don't know if you guys had a chance to read that article, but you might look it up online. In it, a pastor named Tim Winsley says, the congregation is very postmodern in its theology, says Winsley, who co-pastors with his wife, the Reverend Elizabeth Winsley. Christianity is our story, he says, but we don't think of it as the only valid story. In sermons, the Winsleys quote not just from the Bible, but from the Quran or Buddhist texts. The church is clearly designed for spiritual seekers, Tim Winsley says. That's, in essence, what the postmodern Christian church is all about. There's no more absolute truths, there's only relevant truths, and the truth can be expressed through all kinds of different ways. Well, I would say that postmodern is really post-Christian. I would say that what's called the emergent church is really the divergent church in many ways when it comes to the gospel of Jesus Christ. In the name of inclusiveness, we have excluded the only truth that really matters, and that's the truth about the condition of man and about man's only Savior, Jesus Christ. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that we can present the gospel, that gospel, in a very dynamic, changing way, using different methods, different media. For instance, just in this last 5 or 6 years, we've had a tremendous increase of the use of the internet. And you can tell me about all the horrible things that are out there, but also I will tell you the wonderful opportunities that have come about because of the internet to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. Things called podcasts, which nobody ever heard of before. And now the gospel is going out worldwide because of it. Our own ministry has been able to extend to numerous countries all around the world because of a new method. The method changes, the message stays the same. That's where I really think the emergent church is making a huge mistake. They're changing not only the method, they're changing the whole message of the gospel. Now in verse 17 of chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians, Paul says, Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. Now look at this. He says, not with clever words, so that the cross of Christ will not be emptied of its effect. The divergent gospel is really no gospel at all because it has no effect of salvation. And that's what it is or should be all about. Otherwise, it's just making us feel good. You know, can't we just all get along together? Let's hold hands around the campfire and sing Kumbaya. And meanwhile, we're sitting on the deck of the Titanic and the thing is going down and we're just rearranging the deck chairs. If there's no effect, there's no reason other than just a feel-good message. So then in the balance of the chapter, verses 18 through 31, which we're going to look at today, Paul is taking on those that began relying on the philosophies, the feel-good messages from the culture around them, rather than the true gospel of Jesus Christ. So he goes on in verse 18, for to those who are perishing, the message of the cross is foolishness. But to us who are being saved, it is God's power. Now, Paul just got done, as I said, saying he didn't come with clever words. We don't win people to Jesus Christ by our rhetoric, by our lofty arguments, or public speaking skills. In fact, Paul says the actual message of the gospel itself is kind of silly. It's kind of foolish. You are telling me that the only way that I can get to heaven is by believing in some guy who lived 2,000 years ago, half the world away, and was executed by the Romans? Come on. You're kidding, right? It can't be like that. You know, we want something to do. There's always got to be some component in the human idea of salvation that gives us some credit. Now that might be the 7 pillars of Islam. And if we can fulfill the 7 pillars, then we might go to heaven and have 70 virgins waiting for us. It might be that we make a mistake in this life and we'll come back as a higher life form in the next life where we hopefully won't make as many mistakes and we'll slowly work our way towards salvation. There are all kinds of ways that we as humans try to enter into the equation. Well, the gospel doesn't make much sense, does it? Just from a human standpoint. But it works. You might go to the doctor and he might tell you, you're going to die. But there's a new life-saving procedure that we can do that will save your life. And then he tells you what it is and you go, I don't believe you. You've got to be kidding me. If somebody were to tell you 2,000 years ago, we're going to take a piece of a pig and we're going to cut you open, remove a part of your body and put that part of a pig in there and that'll save your life, they'd go, Rêve. Ever heard of valve replacement? It's done all the time. And it does save lives. So yeah, the gospel sounds pretty silly, but it works. That's what matters. Paul said in Romans chapter 1, the gospel is the power of God for salvation. And there's just something about the gospel message, the condition of man, that we are evil from birth and destined to be separated from all that's good, and that God, who is all good, decided to come down on earth and provide a way Himself to rescue us. There's something about that that cuts through the clutter, that speaks right to the heart, that goes beyond all the stuff that we set in front of the gospel and of our knowledge of God. And I'm thankful for that. So he says that to those who are perishing, the gospel is foolishness. But to those of us who are being saved, it is God's power. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and I will set aside the understanding of the experts. Where is the philosopher? Where is the scholar? Where is the debater of this age? Hasn't God made the world's wisdom foolishness? For since in God's wisdom the world did not know God through wisdom, God was pleased to save those who believed through the foolishness of the message preached. So Paul first starts out in verse 19, paraphrasing from the prophet Isaiah in chapter 29. He's basically saying that all the philosophies, all the expert thinkers, they all got it wrong. It's like they were up there on some game show, and you had the Lord on one side, and you had all the philosophers in the world on the other, and they rang the bell first. Ding, ding. Okay, what's the answer? And they give it, and then you hear the buzzer. They all got it wrong, he says. Now, whether you have taken philosophy, whether you consider yourself to be a philosopher, you've thought about it. You've thought about at least these three basic ideas that every human has to deal with at some point in their lives. And they are three words: origins, destiny, and purpose. Origins basically says, where did I come from? Destiny, where am I going? Is there life after death? Is there anything after this existence, or do I just cease to exist? And we know somehow innately in the human soul that existence goes on. And then finally, purpose. What am I doing here? Is there any kind of purpose to life at all? If we have no purpose, we have no will to live. So every one of us has to deal with those three basic things. But what Paul is saying is you don't find answers to those questions through high human thought. You only find the answers through lowly humility, bowing to God's thought. So what is, again, that message? God is good and we are not. And we're doomed to be separate from the goodness of God. But God, in His goodness, chose to do what we could not do, and that is pay for that evil. Give us new life. And make us good like Him through the cross of Jesus Christ. And if we simply put our weight down on Him, that's what it means to trust. You trust in Jesus Christ by allowing the weight and the values of your life to rest in Him and what He said. You will be with Him forever, no longer separated. So God's answers to those three basic questions are: one, origins. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Number two, destiny. Those that trust in Jesus will go to a place that Jesus has prepared for us. And three, what is our purpose? While we are here, we are becoming like Him so that we can also share that good news with absolutely everybody that we can. So verse 22, he goes on to talk about how people receive or don't receive wisdom from God. He says, for the Jews ask for signs and the Greeks seek wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. Yet to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is God's power and God's wisdom, because God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Let's talk a little bit about the values that exist out in our world today. I will sum them up for you in, 7 cliches. Stuff that you have heard. Money really does buy happiness. You only go around once in life, so you got to grab for all the gusto that you can. If it feels good, do it. Man is basically good at heart.